be at the expense of something else. And with that, we already have a very, very deep running principle of complementarity. Whenever we deal with science or scientific method in general, one of the questions you hear very often is like, well, by what evidence or by what result will your thesis be falsified? Now, if we're dealing with engineering sciences, that's a perfectly reasonable ask to see what are the margin to which extent we can control a particular theory to reach the desired results. But whether that is the right way to prop up an entire worldview, to me, it's quite questionable. And the Taoists tend to be much firmer on this one and say, like, look, the whole problem of induction, that you can only set up a thesis and then either a result is consistent with that thesis, so you can uphold it, but you can never actually prove it. You can never actually affirm it. You can just verify it, but you never really know whether around the next corner you're going to discover something where it breaks down. Now, for operational purposes, as long as we understand to within which limits our theories are valid, then we can work within those limits. And we know, for example, that we need to do relativistic corrections when we go towards the speed of light, but for driving cars and everyday human level interactions, it's mostly negligible. Like, we don't really need to account for relativity when we move around at our ordinary speeds. However, for our GPS systems, like including the one on the phone and cars and all that, for them to work, there actually the relativistic corrections are very, very significant, because otherwise you would be, I don't know, dozens of meters off, if not more. But because in our everyday life we got away with the simplified reality, which is kind of intuitively obvious, one might say, you know, the whole Newtonian picture of the universe, it seems very almost intuitive. It seems natural that things are very simple and rigid and solid, and I'm a subject and I am alive, and there's a bunch of material stuff out there, and somehow I, as a human individual or any living thing, arose within a essentially dead environment that is just matter, which is kind of like a piece of, I don't know what the common misconception is, and it's just, you know, dumb stuff, like stuff that is just laying around. It's passive. It's like a billiard ball. You can knock it, but it's not really acting on its own. That's a very materialistic, reductionistic picture of the universe. We assume that we can just reduce everything down to essentially more or less billiard balls, just smaller for atoms and such. And it's certainly an interesting direction to explore, but also there, whenever we zoom into something, we need to always account for the complement. Whenever you gain resolution or focus, or you zoom with your attention into a particular aspect, then it's always momentarily that you let go of something else. And in one of the discourses, Alan Watts illustrated this with using a spotlight consciousness, where you have like a laser beam, in a sense, like you zoom in and you look at something very specific, and then you have the floodlight consciousness, which is kind of like paying attention to everything else. And these two are complement. Like, the two together make up all of your reality. And when you have both options, like the one scope that you select and the complementary scope, they together create a partition upon reality. A a partition always means it's like cutting a cake. Like you have a thing which is one, and then you create a dichotomy that you distinguish one part from the rest of it. You can cut through the middle, or you can cut out a piece, or you can create an artificial delineation, but in the background stands always the thing which is being divided. And so when we're dealing with holism, or in general systemic thinking, when you always want to maintain a model of the universe or the system as a whole, you naturally need to go into that domain where you can't just focus and zoom in and specialize on something, but you also need to at least address the counterpart. Maybe you're not dealing with it, but then you need to acknowledge and say, like, okay, that's the part, the rest of the environment which I'm not dealing with. And because right now my focus is a particular, say, an objective where I want to achieve a particular outcome. So if you have something which you cannot affirmatively prove, like all the knowledge that we gain from a scientific method, essentially everything is a probabilistic guess. And you can assess your own probabilities. To which extent can you, I don't know, throw a ball of paper into the bin across the room? I don't know, 30%, 50, 70, probably once in a while, but probably also not 100%. Now, how is that different when you think about driving your car into the garage? I hope very much that you approach very close to 100%, if not 100%. Now, we can never actually ensure that we're going to control it 100%, even if we've had many occurrences where we made it always. That does not predetermine the next situation. So the upcoming situation is always something where we still need to exercise control and exercise our ability. In a sense, it's a free choice, or exercising some degree of discretion in the sense of free will, that we select from all the possible outcomes, driving this way off the road, driving that way off the road. We select one that we prefer and prioritize and correct and adjust. And if you're driving on a highway, it's usually not that you're like perfectly on the middle line of where you're supposed to be, but yes, you're within your general whatever the highway track is called, lane. And yes, and then you're a little bit too far on one side because the road curves, and then you correct a little bit, and then you're a little bit too much on the other side. And of course, we want to minimize this correction. We don't want to be yanking and stressing and accelerating, and because that's inefficient. And for systems, you always want to find the way, the least amount of force necessary. So ideally, if you have to go around the curve, ideally you slow down once if you have to, and then you tilt your wheel to get in a sharper and sharper and sharper curve, and then you open up once, and then you accelerate again. Right? That's how you would navigate optimally around say a sharp turn. What you don't want to do is, like coming too fast and stepping on the brakes, and then it's like, oh, now I slowed down too much. Now I need to accelerate again. And that's like, oh shit, the road, now I have to turn. It's like, no, that was too much. Like that's no way of driving. It's very obvious when you deal with a car. But when it comes to systems, especially automated systems, we sometimes have inaccurate information, and sometimes we simply don't have the mechanism to respond in a timely manner. Sometimes the data that we're operating is based from the past, and so we're just kind of assuming that everything everything keeps going. Meanwhile, unforeseen events may have occurred and changed the situation. And sometimes, even if we respond in the moment with essentially the right correction, sometimes there's a delay, right? If you think, for example, you're sailing in a big boat, and then you see, oh shit, there's a rock. Depending on how fast you're moving and how big the boat is, it doesn't necessarily matter if you see the rock that's right in front of you. Maybe it's too late and you will just hit it, right? So there we need to navigate and calibrate our instruments in a way where we always say, well, okay, if I move at that velocity, then I will have this kind of delay, this kind of response time, and this sort of inertia, and I need to account for all these aspects to be able to actually control the outcome. And whenever we talk about physical interaction, it becomes quite obvious. Like, yeah, of course, that's what you need to do. But when we deal with purely informational mechanisms and dynamics, it becomes much harder to tell on one side because our intuition is not necessarily developed. Sometimes because the dynamics can be very counterintuitive to understand if we veer too much from the regularity of the human condition. And even within the human realm where we say, okay, there's people making rules, making decisions, and choosing their, basically governing or structuring their behavior, their activity in a way to, I don't know, obey certain rules. Let's say you drive on a particular side of the road. It doesn't really matter on which one, but it's important that everyone drives on the same road, right? You can invert it, but then everyone has to switch it because otherwise it's chaos. So there you could say the choice whether you drive on the left or on the right side of the road as a system, as a road network, is invariant. You can flip the whole thing and then you switch the roundabouts and then everything works out again. But you can't just say, well, it's invariant and therefore everyone does whatever they want, and one guy drives on the left and one drives on the right, and we're in a disaster. So in a similar way, we always want to look at what is it that we're focusing on, what have we left out, what's the rest of the system, right? That we carve out a piece, essentially we draw a boundary around it and say, like, that's the focal point, that's the domain of interest. And then whenever we do have a boundary, there's, in a sense, an inside and an outside, or at least two different domains. It doesn't necessarily mean that one needs to be embedded in another. One example is, for example, me in this body. When I look out, I see other people and I perceive them to be within my perception. So my trying to remember who did that TED talk. Maybe it was Anil Seth. There's a TED talk about you hallucinate your reality that really kind of confronts you with to which extent that we are constructing the reality that we're experiencing. That doesn't mean that there's no external reality. I'm not arguing that point. But everything that we perceive is perceived through our senses, and our senses means our sensory nervous system. The nervous system ends at latest where our body ends, right? I don't have a nerve out here, but I can hear. How do I hear a sound out here if my eardrum ends here? And I have a nervous system going to the eardrum and the anvil, or whatever the thing is called in English. And from there, I can understand. Yeah, it can propagate and go into the brain, and then how did the brain hear out here? And obviously, if you ever examine such question, it becomes very quickly visible, but then also rather impressive, what our mind is capable to do, not just visually to reconstruct the three-dimensional world, but also acoustically and dynamically, that we have a sense of velocity. That let's say you're on a beach and there's a big wave coming towards you. You feel you have a visceral response to the kind of intensity that you. This is not the nervous system. I'm not saying that the wave is picking you up and smashing you into the ground or something like that. Simply by looking at a big wave, and let's say the water receding, and you're looking at a wall of water, there is a kind of in a sense, an emotional and a fairly intense experience. Another one could be, you go up to a cliff. Now, if you're very, very well in control, that may be a little bit diminished if you know exactly how to handle yourself, and it kind of goes, that altitude becomes less perceptible. But if you really pay attention, and let's say there is no rail, for example, then that impulse will kick in again. And these, this way, our whole neurology has, in a way, developed to out of fairly primitive signals. If you think about the actual information which we're receiving, we tend to render a quite sophisticated, rich reality. In a sense, our brain is already doing what we're now approaching with technological development to artificially create a virtual reality environment where we do a certain kind of rendering for our senses to kind of simulate the reality that then interfaces with our nervous system, and then the nervous system propagates the impulses to the brain, and then the brain assembles and combines all the information that is available, and then we render a high-level cognitive response, like the three-dimensional reality that we see, in the image of what the stimuli was that was being fed to us. But the information which we're actually receiving, the bandwidth and the interface, if you think, for example, now the eye, you have those, whatever they're called, these cones, these I think microtubules or some sort of tube which is sensitive to a particular frequencies, and you have different ones. You have 3 different ones. Some women have 4. It's very, very rare, and I think it only happens with women for some reason, that they have a 4th receptor. And I always found that curious, but I never really looked into it. But most people, by default, we have 3 receptors, which means we have 3 channels. If you think of a spectrum of like coming from infrared through the whole rainbow colors until ultraviolet, and then far, far, far up where we, like after ultraviolet, there's a lot of frequencies that we just can't see, but we have other devices that operate in, for example, Wi-Fi is operating, is essentially still using photons, so the particles of light that we know from visible light. The high frequency technology that we're using for mobile phones and all the wireless transmission, that's all essentially just shifting, moving the spectrum of the frequency up to a higher domain where we can't see it. And in fact, the amount of information that we are not perceiving is kind of staggering when you think about whenever you use your phone to look something up. You can say, well, maybe the why you're not really sure. You can't really be convinced that everything is there already without you doing it, because it could be that you send a signal and then the whole thing creates a response, right? That's kind of how we experience the internet, right? The internet doesn't really do too much unless we prompt something, and then we get a response, and then it's like, oh, there's actually a network there, and I can actually interact with it. But unless I interact with my device, I may not be confronted with this. But when you consider radio waves, the ones which you don't control, where you only can adjust the channel, right? You like the old transistor radios. There, the frequency already has to be there. Whatever channel you can find was there before you built the radio. I mean, before we built a radio, but obviously after we put up the antennas, right? The human these broadcast stations that we set up. Well, I mean, it's a deep rabbit hole. I'm not going to go through the whole depth of this exploration, but there's some really great videos by Richard Feynman where he describes about the whole process, how the eye, the stimuli, the information that we're actually perceiving is so limited. It's roughly equivalent to if you have a pool, like a regular swimming pool, and you have, I don't know, 15 people jumping in the pool and splashing and swimming around and making a big mess, and the water going up and down, and then you would have a sensor like a bug sitting on the water line and observing all the fluctuations from the water, and from that kind of information we reconstruct the whole 3-dimensional picture. And to me this was not only fascinating, but again one of these feats when there's so many things that we just take for granted because it works in our everyday human life it's kind of like, oh, well, obviously I open my eyes and then the world is there, because that's how vision happens. You know, the world kind of goes into my eyes and then I have an experience and see the world. You know, we learn this as kids, but if you really start to examine how that really happens, and then to consider some beliefs, you often hear this quoted for natural selection and origin of the species, Charles Darwin. But what people often miss in this story is what Darwin really was advocating as a theory is quite different from how it is presented today. Because today we are running with the interpretation of, I think was it Spencer Brown? It was a somewhat contemporary, like he overlapped with Darwin, but he created an interpretation of what Darwin really meant to say once Darwin was already passed away. So Darwin wasn't really there to say like, well, no, that's not exactly what I meant, and you're kind of mixing things up here and there. And yeah, so the original, well, see, one thing is saying, well, we just have random mutations, right? We have cosmic rays, and there we also, because we don't really have an explanation why exactly this, we have some mechanism how it could happen, but we can't really predict them. We can't really anticipate them. We just, whenever they appear, then we say like, well, probably it was from, I don't know, some particle ejected from some supernova explosion or some other collision, some big intergalactic event, or at least interstellar event that generated some particle that was flying through us, and then now it hit the Earth and created a cosmic ray. Okay, that's you know, it's possible, but it's not very useful, because it doesn't allow us to predict it, and much less it doesn't allow us to control it. So even if that would be the full story, it's not that interesting of a story. Anyway, now I deviated into cosmic rays. I didn't need to go there. Just the mutations, just thinking about genetic mutations being random. This, I think, comes with a substantial bias of this materialistic view, this view that we are living in an essentially alienated, dead world, and we are living things in an otherwise dead universe, and so we have to kind of struggle for survival to essentially subordinate the death or entropic reality where everything disintegrates, and then somehow we would like to prevail within it. That's not a very empowering way to look at things, and personally, it seems to me people that adhere to this materialistic worldview, if you look at them, if you kind of explore how a person responds and what kind of answers they give, and how they relate to, for example, to authority in general, not just physical authority, right? There's a certain kind of physical nature. You don't really need to argue with it. You can't just say like, well, I don't like gravity and I'm going to disregard it. It's like, well, okay, you can try, but I'd say the bar is not too low, because it's hard to find people who manage. So if we start with an essentially dead universe, and then out of that dead universe we want to somehow run through a model, run through a process of whether it's from volcanoes and carbon processes and some heat capture and volcanic vents, and then eventually you have carbon interacting with other basic molecules until you start to have the first precursors of what we then could consider to be a metabolic process. Yes. Okay. I mean, I don't know how loud this is. Let me see. Okay. There's some background noise. I hope it's okay. I'm quickly going to check what the audio is doing. Just to see if I need to interrupt for a moment. But yeah, no, I think it's fine. Okay, so we can assume this perspective that the universe essentially is a dead, dumb thing, and it's a big machine, it's a big mechanism, and the more that mechanism interacts with itself, somehow the more complex things become, and the more complex things become eventually. Okay, I'm tempted to reboot this. Yeah, let's try. Don't seem to have. Yeah. So this assumption that the universe is essentially just a big billiard table with many different billiard balls, where everything just kind of is entirely deterministic. I think that position, that perspective on the world needs to be examined, because it's very, very difficult to get from that starting point to the richness and the depth of the understanding that could lead to the richness of a subjective conscious experience with qualities, and which is dynamic and all that. I'm not saying it's not possible. Personally, I actually believe that there's two complementary starting points, that you can start with consciousness, and from consciousness create further and further confinements or bounds or limitations to define more and more and more and more structure, until eventually you get to you have the whole thing so confined and so slowed down that you start to generate lower and lower aggregate states, until the lowest one of them being the quality of solidity, right? Something that is solid and stable. You can think of like the floor, or rock, or wood, but of course we have more extreme examples like a diamond. We know that is something that's very, very stable, and then beyond that we even have super solids. So super solid is kind of like the sibling from a superfluid and from a superconductor, like these very optimal conditions where you have a grid which is basically incompressible, and then because of that can present you or confront you with some quite unique properties. These sort of exotic materials can they of course have their use values. So high temperature superconductors, for example, are highly sought after for many. Okay, now we have noise. For magnets, for example, if you need to have a strong magnetic field, but even without having a specific applied use case, they can demonstrate and reveal all sorts of properties of the reality where, unless we push reality to its limit, we can have all sorts of theory, and as long as they're kind of murky enough and kind of more or less blend together, it's like, it's, you can look at it one way and you can look at it another way. But sometimes one particular model has an implication of what the next step, in a sense of the next depth, like the next step in evolutionary sense, to develop a scientific understanding, to develop a theory. That can be helpful if you already have a perspective that points in the right direction. Then you have a better chance to discover that what is yet to be discovered. Whereas if you have some alternative formulation which is also consistent and also agrees with the results but points in another direction, the difficulty is it's not always that easy to tell ahead of time which one is the one that is leading to the next one. But if we have multiple theories that kind of seem to operate independently, then we can start to look at parallels and correspondences or similarities, and see then, even if we don't yet have a connecting theory, then we can sometimes take what we learn in one domain and see what happens if we apply it to another domain, because then we have a clear model that we then can test and verify. And sometimes we can say, okay, well, you know, it works. Let's say, for example, for atoms, it works like this and this and this. And now let's see, does it also apply for the planets? Well, usually it goes the other way around. I think we start with the planets first, and then we said, what does it apply to the atoms? And some things are fairly good in approximation, and yet then there are differences where the metaphor or the parallel doesn't hold. But it's actually quite surprising how often we learn a principle or discover a principle in one domain, and then suddenly it pops out in a completely different place. Now, when we're dealing with physical reality, we can say like, well, okay, then maybe there's a deeper physical reality, which then gives rise to a high level reality, and then we see an effect once here and an effect once here, but there's a deeper reality behind it. Okay, that's I think a reasonable position to take, but it's not so easy in the domain of mathematics, because it also happens, for example, modular forms. So maybe you know you definitely know the first four basic operations, and then there's a fifth one in basic arithmetic. So you have addition, subtraction, multiplication, division, and then you have modulo. Modulo is like, you know, you divide something by a fixed number, and then let's say you divide 7 by 4, and then you get 4 once, and you chop off the 4, and then you have 3 left. So modulo always gives you a remaining piece, what's left over, and then from that you start to map or identify with the remainder, and then you have an equivalence class. So you could say, for example, if you divide 11 by 4, you get 4, and then you get 4 again, 8, and then you have 3 left. So 11 and 7 are in the same equivalence class with respect to modulo 4. So that's kind of just so that we're on the same page of what a modulo operation is. And then modular forms is the same concept, but often for higher dimensional objects, and for polytopes, and for all sorts of mathematical structures, which can be subdivided and then identified by categories. And these sort of modular forms, they pop up in all sorts of things where we really don't really have any good a good reason why they should show up there. And this then ties into the question in mathematics in general, where people sometimes ask the question, is mathematics created or is it discovered? And to a large extent, I would say there is a certain structure which we are able to discover independent of, I would say almost independent of what species that we are, as long as we are able to have complex thoughts, right? I mean, the monkeys and dogs, they don't have the ability to process complex thoughts. So they're the human, as far as we know. So this is something I learned through presentations from Noam Chomsky. He talks about the language faculty, that if you reduce the language faculty all the way down to the most basic function, you end up with a dictionary, that you have a subjective symbol and an external event, or I mean, it doesn't have to be an event, an external representation, let's say apple or danger or something good or something risky or whatever, and you have an internal representation where you have the subjective, the immediate experience that you have within your immediate consciousness and what it corresponds to externally. So that's the mapping. These creates a dictionary. You know, and he presented this in the context of exploring, why do different cultures have mathematics? Why do we have numbers? Because it's not that obvious that you have a survival reason, that it gives you survival advantage if you can count how many, I don't know, apples or whatever people had back then when we were hunter-gatherers. And it doesn't seem plausible that having math would be such a strong advantage that it would allow everyone to basically that everything else would die out, and there you have a species where everyone can do math. So that's not a likely explanation. And then he went into this, the language faculty, that the language faculty on the basis having a dictionary, and the dictionary, one of the first things you need to do is to distinguish things. You need to have you have one thing, and then you have another thing that you need to be able to distinguish. And the moment you can distinguish things, you can count them, and when you can count them, then you can enumerate them, and when you have an enumerator, then you have a discrete infinity. So meaning like you can always count further. That's a very different from the notion of infinity as a number, as something that is infinite large, because there is a domain of mathematics that deals with infinities, that deals with different degrees of infinities. You know, something can be more infinite than other things, even though naively you would think you can just say, well, you know, if you have infinity on both sides of the equation, then you're done, and you know, it's either meaningless or it's either the same. But that's just one way of dealing with infinities. And whenever you hear an infinity, you have to meet the situation with a bit of scrutiny of what that infinity really signifies, or what it really implies. Because sometimes it's just a bit of a vague subject. It can be many different things. You know, it's like the concept of a door is an abstract subject. Is it good to go through the door or not good? Depends where you are. Depends where the door is. Depends where the door leads to. Right? It's like you can't have a general answer of how you're going to behave around the door, whether you're trying to open it or whether you're trying to lock it. Very much depends on the situation. And similar things apply when it comes to infinities. Usually, when you deal with infinities, or also with the number 0, there's usually an additional degree of freedom that is hidden somewhere that you could access, but the current model that we're running is not able to go there. So one example, for example, is today we have the limit. Because of the speed of light, we end up generating Schwarzschilds either by high velocities, meaning acceleration, or strong gravity, also being same underlying principle, according to Einstein's equivalence principle, right? Whether you accelerate with a rocket, or whether you just hover above a gravitational body that is pulling on you, he says that's the same force, in the sense that it's not distinguishable, at least not from within general relativity, right? That's where we are today. Now, back to that notion about the universe just being a material dumb machine, in a sense. That's that sort of thinking comes in again and again and again in well, I guess it's a little bit of like a partial understanding on the side of our contemporary human intellect, that we have a lot of kind of nonsense floating around which we have not been able to weed out. And it's not just that people have inertia to learn or to update beliefs. I mean, that's part of the issue, but a much deeper problem is that we often have something that has only a limited application, or is only correct under a specific set of conditions, and is not valid in general. And then you have another thing which is valid in another domain, and you know it works over there, and you can't extrapolate it because it breaks down, or it becomes inconsistent, or ends up generating some sort of trouble. And then you have different things that work locally where you're dealing with them, and yet it can become very difficult to reconcile them. So that's part of the adventure that I would like to take us on. Probably not today, but if all goes well within the coming days, to see how can we, in an approach which is invariant to any given assumption, and the consequences of that, how can we construct principles, meaning from within, from first principles approach, how can we build up principles by which we can organize and make sense of the world in a way which is universal, meaning in a way which we can operate principles completely independent of where we find ourselves in the universe or the moment in time when it comes, like it shouldn't be dependent on culture, it shouldn't be dependent on knowledge, it shouldn't be dependent on a particular environment or having access to particular things, but more like the concept of a compass, that you have something which helps you to orient yourself, and based on which you can not only orient yourself but start to relate and triangulate among others, and then from that being able to coordinate with our environment. And the case we're going to look at specifically is going to be the situation, what the implications are for open systems. In general, whenever you hear things invoked like with thermodynamics, second law of thermodynamics, and a lot of with the theorems that are propped up by that, what they often kind of leave out is that the second law of thermodynamics is what was originally, it came out of in inspecting and studying steam engines, and whenever you have volumes and pressures and that whole theory, everything that led to thermodynamics to be developed as an aspect of science. Maybe actually I want to before going there, I need to say one more thing, which is even more important. Thermodynamics is a statistical law. That means if you run an experiment many times, you can predict what the distribution is going to be. You cannot predict the individual event. Right? It's like throwing dice. You know which phase will, or which combination of points will come how often, but you cannot predict the actual throw. So that's one thing that we need to clear out right away, that it's not a predictive law, it's a statistical law. And then it's a statistical law that only deals with finite systems. That means systems which are fixed in the amount of microstates that the whole system can have. So you have the macrostate, which is the system, and then you have the microstate, which is the individual configurations that the system can have. And to the extent that you, from the macrostate, cannot tell the specific configuration of the microstates, that's what we call entropy. So entropy is a measure of our ignorance of a system. It's not that entropy increases in the sense of that information increases. That is, it's not wrong, because if you combine information and make things more complex, you do generate more richness in a sense of, we could say, in a chaotic way, right? If you smush a bunch of, I don't know, colors together and mix them all up, it can become very messy, and it seems like very complicated to describe the whole thing. But that's just one side of the story, because on the other side, while before you had different colors and different patterns, there you had some structure. And if you have only randomness, that you basically, think of white noise, right? It's just like some of the dots are bright and some of them are dark, and overall it kind of looks like a bunch of ants running around. But it's there's not really any information in a sense, in a useful sense, because there's no more structure. So we always have this balance. On one side, we want to maximize for structure. That's really what happens with life, right? Life goes against entropy. So that doesn't mean that entropy ultimately is violated. It doesn't mean that the second law of thermodynamics is out the window. Just to be very clear on this. The second law of thermodynamics holds as a statistical law for closed systems. When you deal with open systems, then there's second order properties that you need to take into considerations. We will come to this in the discussion. Well, I want to go down and explore entanglement, entropy, and complexity, how it is understood from physical systems, especially from black holes and entangled black holes. There's a lot of work being done by Lenny Susskind, for example. He has some excellent presentations that that I will draw on. But then also how this applies to information theory. And in information theory, we have like computer science for quantum computation and these sorts of information theoretic limits. They are, when you do computer science, you always deal with a space where it's very comfortable or very natural to go towards an optimal limit. Obviously, the things that we build, they're often they lag a bit behind the optimum. But when you consider physical sciences, there it's much more difficult to control a physical condition to get something to, I don't know, like a perfect monochromatic light, or something down to absolute zero, or as close to as you can get it, or even just controlling any physical process to the extent that we want to control the outcome predictable. That's quite challenging, but that's an engineering challenge. It's not a scientific challenge. So that's a challenge in engineering, and how to apply the science that we already know or believe that should hold, right? If we're not sure about what laws to apply, then we're experimenting. Then we're not engineering. To do engineering, we generally assume that the laws that we invoke, that we use to build something, that they will hold. And so when we do computer science, there we go to the opposite end. So for example, when you design an algorithm for encryption, for example, you underneath the algorithm there's a mathematical problem usually, and then you understand that the mathematical problem is hard in a sense that it cannot be solved within less steps, or within that it takes you at least a certain amount of computations to break an encryption, for example, unless you have the matching key. And there you want to have an asymmetric function where the encryption, if you have the key, if you use the key for encryption, should be really fast, and to decrypt should be really hard, unless you know the key, how it was encrypted, and then with the proper key you can decrypt it. But if you design such an algorithm, for example, a common measure that you will use is that you say, like, okay, how many steps, if I think I can, how many distinct actions, if I assume, if I grant you the power to have any mathematical calculation that you can articulate, you can do it in one step, even though the computer may take many steps to do a particular step. But if you can have a one-step function that you can clearly articulate, you can idealize it and say, like, okay, given I have a processor which can do this in one cycle, which is not, usually it's not realistic, but it's an over-idealization, deliberate. And then, okay, now how many of those operations do I need to break a particular code? Okay, then what's the most efficient semiconductor that we have today? You know? And then you take the semiconductor. Don't think about how hard it is to make that semiconductor and how much you can make it. Just take the best and go to the extremes and offer like the most efficient algorithm, the most efficient semiconductor, and then you go like, what's the general power availability of us as a species, like the global energy availability of all the power plant and the sunlight that comes in and all that. And then you say, okay, now if I would use all that energy that our species has available today, and I account for I don't know, I think right now it's about 2% growth of our energy consumption. So you say, okay, rolling forward, like I'm going to increase the budget but every year by 2% or 5% or 10% or whatever you want to make it. And then if I apply all that power, just divvying it up to run it all on the most efficient semiconductor, and then what's the hash rate? Like how many calculations can I do, and then how many years or millennia will it take to break a particular algorithm? Again, much of that is propped up on that we believe a particular mathematical problem is hard, and it's not always that easy to really be certain of that, right? It's not as simple to simply say, well, you know, we just want to prove that it's hard, because proof, and it's an everyday kind of sloppy human parlor. We might say, I know that's proof of this is proof of that, but and a court case maybe would probably have a little bit more stricter standards. So like, well, you know, like that you have a certain evidence and you take all the evidence together, but proof already has a little bit of an elevated standard there, as opposed to how many people use it rather casually. But when it comes to mathematics, even if you can prove something, that proof still operates within a framework of certain assumptions. And there's some really interesting work. Like, to me, it's very fascinating. Done by Vladimir Voevodsky. He, unfortunately, he's deceased now, but he was working on the foundations of mathematics, and he advocated univalent foundations because well, certain problems with set theory. Usually we start with set theory, and then from there we kind of get to the point where it's like, okay, and all these transformations within what you can do among sets, you can demonstrate that within that rule set you can remain consistent, but it's not as solid as many of us would like it to be, and it's much of mathematics is not constructive, and whenever a branch of mathematics is not constructive, it holds for whatever the assumptions that we're usually running with, but when you loosen certain axioms, right? For example, we learn Pythagoras, right? We have that a squared plus b squared is equal to c squared if you have a right angle, and this relationship of the squares that you can, in a triangle, you can kind of prop out the square from all the angles, and then the two smaller ones are the same area as the large one. That's a very nice theorem, but it assumes that you have Euclidean planes, that you have flat space, and that everything exists within a singular, within a plane that is flat. And it's very nice and easy, but if you say, well, I'm not sure if I can rely on the space being flat, because the spaces that I'm going to be dealing with are not always flat. They can be hyperbolic or spherical, and then you need to generalize it, and then there's an equivalent formulation that essentially says the same thing, but there you use the inner product as a generalization to loosen that restrictions around these Euclidean axioms. And in the same way, we always need to inspect how did we get to a particular view, and were all these previous steps really warranted. Sometimes they're valid, but sometimes we implicitly make a choice where we didn't mean to make a choice. We just said, oh, it has to be like this, because obviously it's like this from some, you know, day-to-day level intuition that we have. But our intuitions are roughly applicable to pretty much as far as you can run and as high as you can jump, right? That's what you evolved to, you know, also for safety's sake, right? If you run full speed into a wall, you know, you're probably going to get hurt, but you're going to survive. If you drive 200 on a bike or in a car or plane or whatever, you need to exercise a lot of cognitive restriction to anticipate a response that you are not intuitively evolved to process. And with the adequate training, we can learn to control and discipline our conduct so that we can, I don't know, jump out of airplanes, race on the racetrack, and with the right technology and the right training and the right safety margins, we can learn to manage the risk. We should never really go to the point and say we have the illusion that we can control the risk, because human biology and biology in general is always to a certain extent structured to recover and not to be perfect. So whenever any action depends on you executing something perfectly, over time that's problematic. Even if you get away with it once or twice, I wouldn't pursue something where you have to rely on an execution to be perfect. I just don't think it's wise. And yeah, in my own times I did my own exploration in yeah, maybe for another time. Now, but we really need to get past this point of treating the material universe as something dumb, because whenever we always try to reduce it to a randomity, then we end up with really weird conclusions. And then if it seems so intuitive that the universe has to be dumb because somehow we internalize that, or because to be honest, I think many people actually never ever got to examine the questions. And not just because of laziness. Sometimes it's because of simply because it's not accessible, right? If you don't know where you need to start looking, this is, for example, something that Popper said, which is kind of a cornerstone of how we are doing science today. He said, look, basically, there's no epistemological foundation for what we're doing. We're just kind of driving piles down out into the swamp until we kind of create a solid enough foundation. Then we just run with it. And if it starts to drift and move and it's not stable enough, then we take more piles and we drive them further into the swamp until we have again. Yes, okay. I understand that for pragmatic purposes, it's good enough. But really, as an endeavor of our collective human intellect, as a species, to generate knowledge, to understand ourselves, the nature, our relationship to it, that seems an unjustified low bar. Like, yes, sometimes it's easy to take it, and it's perfectly justified for operational purposes to simplify something. It's like, okay, I'm not going to deal with all the philosophy and all the complexity and all what it all really means. I just need to get from here to there right now, and I need to find the right way to do it. That's fine. But when it comes to the foundation of science, and with epistemology, that's the domain which deals with by which means we generate knowledge. There we need to be a little bit more diligent. Because if we have biases on these fundamental level, then whatever we build on top will carry these biases forward. That doesn't mean that it's necessarily wrong. That's like if we find out that, okay, we have additional dynamics that come in, for example, for open systems. That doesn't mean that suddenly thermodynamics doesn't hold anymore and planes don't fly anymore. Everything that we built so far, everything that works, is a kind of a special case. And then suddenly we see, like, okay, that was just a particular reality, and there is a larger picture that we now need to consider. And in physics, this is another source of great confusion today, mainly in the kind of pop science that we often, or I guess some of us, occasionally encounter in news and articles and discussions. And I'm very much in favor of making specialized knowledge accessible to a wider public, to have more people better informed. And yeah, I think there's really a lot of magnificent knowledge out there. There's a wealth of information, a world which is fascinating, which is magnificent, and which we usually don't even scratch the surface. And I'm not just talking about science. There's much more to it. But we're going to start somewhere now. And yeah, if we start with the wrong assumptions, then we're going to end up disqualifying things which might be relevant, and we're at the same time we're going to uphold a belief, no matter how absurd it is. I mean, to me, this is maybe a bit opinionated now, but to me, the assumption that something as complex and as rich as the human eye could just evolve as a randomity from a bunch of biochemical interactions, and then suddenly that becomes the viable thing because of some survival replication argument. That there's just no way. There's just absolutely no way that the complexity and the richness of evolution is not evolving towards something. If entropy really was all there was, and there would just be like random mutation, then you would have to have all over the place just chaotic mutation. Basically, you would have to find yourself in a world which to a high degree is always kind of dying off in a sense because it's not viable. Not dying off because it gets old, but dying off because it mutates randomly in a way which is not viable within the system that the organism finds itself in. And there's a version of this on the level of physics. So we had from Kepler and then Newton, we had the Newtonian picture of the universe, which is kind of the mechanistic, the time just flows and basically has no characteristics, and just time just keeps going and going and going, and space is flat, and we have 3 dimensions and all that. Intuitively, people are still kind of hung up in this because it's a good approximation for everyday, again, you know, getting into elevators and walking around the house, driving cars, things like that. But the problem is the people working in these fields, they are also still driving cars and walking around and subject to the same bias. And not bias, but the same, for operational purposes, simplifications. Again, it's fine to simplify as long as we are aware that we're doing it. But if it becomes so second nature that we don't think about it, it becomes more and more tricky to identify when we are rolling with a simplification where it's really not justified and we're really living a part of reality out. And when it came to quantum mechanics a bit more than 100 years ago, or when these first effects started to show up, it suddenly was clear that there were correlations that were not strictly local, that were not predetermined. This goes back to, well, I think that one of the best papers about it is, I want to say 1957, but, you know, within 10 years of that. Don't quote me on that. But it's somewhere around that where Bell wrote his paper about Bell inequalities. And that is something that then could be demonstrated and verified that the, okay, I have a visitor here. Yes. So we have the Bell inequalities, and there we could see, okay, it really is not a hidden variable or some other trick that nature is playing on us, but it is something that it's essentially people had to come to terms that reality really is quantum mechanical. And in all these PopSci articles, we say like, oh, it's so paradoxical, oh, it's so confusing. It's like, reality is not confusing. Humans are confusing. Humans have a tendency to kind of disregard information if it goes against what they already made up their mind to be the correct view. And this, I guess it's just a certain resistance, a certain inertia to update our beliefs, which is not necessarily a bad thing, because before we update and revise beliefs, you know, it shouldn't be because of a one-off, because something happens once, we just overthrow a complete belief system that we have for the rest of our lives. That wouldn't be sound. But at the same time, we tend to be too far on the opposite side, and I believe in large because we lack the necessary communication infrastructure. The same way how Popper says, okay, we drive all these piles out into the swamp to create a foundation without there being any actual referent. Right? That's the problem with this approach, with this way of looking at this. It's not that as long as everyone stands on the same platform, yes, then you can point to the same things, and you can kind of figure your way around it locally because you're already interacting locally. But if you're saying the numbers, like indexical numbers, 1, 2, 3, 4, that they're counting numbers, they are part of mathematics, and they are just there to be discovered. They exist whether you know about them or not. They're not going to go away because you forget about them, and they're also not going to be invented simply because you thought of them. But they are part of essentially logic, that you can distinguish things, and then you can, if you can distinguish one, you can identify one, and then you have another one, and then you have more, and it goes in the same direction as Chomsky went with discrete infinities. We in school we start counting with fingers. First we use a decimal system pretty much because we have 10 of those. It wasn't always like this. I met some older people in England that they had like the old systems where they didn't have decimal. I know sometimes for counting like the 12 is used as a basis. Sometimes it's 16. Again, unless you're doing computer science or unless you're doing a specialized work in math, we always use base 10. But that's simply for, yeah, because it's a convention. There's no other way to say it. And then you can say, well, okay, we have binary, and this binary not maybe more basic, and maybe that should be the reference system binary as opposed to decimal. That's what you might have guessed 50 years ago. But binary and decimal is, I mean, yeah, they can be transformed back and forth, and you can have hexadecimal, and you can have like all these common number systems that we use in on our computing devices. But they're still quite similar because you can just reformulate one into another. But when you start dealing with continuous systems, then suddenly you have first of it's no longer countable. You still have something that you can count, but the part which you can count no longer is able to give you a complete picture unless you construct additional structure upon your numbers. So if you think, for example, anything which is cyclic, that could be from new moon to new moon, at a full moon cycle, or a full year, an astrological year. Astronomical, I guess it's all the same in this case. Well, let's stick with the spatial geometry, that you have the rotation that the Earth revolves around the sun. Then you can say, okay, we just passed the winter solstice yesterday, and then you have the same in the summer. That you could say like, okay, these are the poles. Now, you probably wouldn't want to say that one is 0 and the other one is 1, because how would that be justified? That one is neutral and the other one exists? That would be, if anything, the sun would be the neutral one because everything revolves around the sun, and so therefore you would have to deal with -1 and then +1. Now you have a trinary system, but it's not a trinary that you only have 0, plus and -1, but you actually have all the intermediary states in between. And if you want to have a continuous transformation symmetry, which is most of our most powerful laws that we know about our physical reality, they come from preserved quantities, and these quantities are only preserved because there is a transformation symmetry. So, for example, that I can rotate continuously, that's a rotational transformation symmetry, which every 360 degrees I make a full rotation. But if I take a cube, for example, then there's by half pi, like 90 degrees, I'm already back in a congruent position, assuming like all the edges are the same, everything's the same color. Right? And just 90-degree rotation in any direction actually is a symmetry, but it's not continuous. Oops, what did I do here? Okay, but I wasn't done ranting about treating the material universe as a dumb object, because it really leads to a lot of problems. In physics, so coming from this Newtonian picture and then being confronted with quantum mechanics, and then eventually getting to a point where we can no longer ignore it away, it was it was quite difficult to figure out how do we get from the quantum mechanical reality that we know exists in the lab, and how can we then get back to the Newtonian Cartesian reality that we all have become so accustomed to. I think that whole effort is completely misguided, because there's really no reason to assume that reality would be quantum mechanical. And this again goes back to the situation about the, let's say, maybe human temperament, that we would like the simpler case to be true simply because it's more convenient for us. But that's not why we're here, and that's not why nature is around us, to make things convenient for us. In some things, we have evolved in a way which is harmonious with our environment, and therefore we have natural processes which just seem to almost happen by themselves. But as a basic assumption, to always assume that I think it's good to always go for the simplest solution first, but it's unwarranted to assume that reality is trying to be simple. Sometimes you have very simple rules that end up generating a very complicated effect, a very complicated pattern. And so the first one that kind of started to defend this position was Hugh Everett, where said, like, look, all your special rules about how you come from a quantum mechanical result and how you collapse to the wave function, and how you from there then reconstruct your Newtonian reality, it's like, that's completely unnecessary. You just drop all that part and just follow the Schrödinger equation, and no collapse of the wave function. And then people said, like, well, no, obviously that can't be the case, because if that would be true, if you would just be following the Schrödinger equation, then whenever there's multiple possibilities, all of them happen, because that's what we have to do mathematically. And therefore you always have to kind of, it's like a decision tree where you always have to branch and create more branches. And that seems completely absurd, because you will end up with this explosion of universes. Well, the first thing that this kind of argument kind of neglects is, yes, you have a certain amount of richness that you will spread out, but there's also a certain saturation that happens. It's not every choice becomes meaningful, because sometimes you can be invariant, right? If there's a path and then along the path there's a tree, I can go on the left side or on the right side. They actually do have to make a choice, because otherwise I run into the tree. But whether I take one path or the other is actually to a high degree invariant, unless along that one path I would interact with something which is local to that path. But otherwise, if you just look at the larger segment, you just started here and you ended up here, and there was a tree in between, and either you went left or right, but it doesn't really matter. So people challenged Everett and said, like, no, but then the universe would constantly be branching into infinite directions. And his response was, exactly. That's exactly what I'm saying. That's exactly what the equations are saying. It's not coming from Everett. He just said, like, look, you don't have confidence. So sometimes we do extrapolate a theory beyond the domain where it's valid. And then very often where you get nonsensical answers. But sometimes we get very clear answers and just don't like the answer. And then we try to resist the answer and say, like, well, there has to be something wrong, because I don't want to believe that reality actually is like this. I think the part that here makes it again so confusing is that people come with this perspective of treating the universe as being this dumb randomity that just chaotically goes in every possible way that it can go and kind of dissipates in all directions possible. That's not impossible, but I just don't think that that's very likely, because there always seems to be some sort of complementarity. To me, one of the most beautiful ways how this is illustrated is in the case of lightning, for example. If you look at a lightning, a photograph or a time lapse, if somebody manages to capture it, we know that the lightning kind of branches out and has these forks. But what really happens is that you have all sorts of potential fields that are all kind of aware of each other. it's not like an electron is actually zipping around and throwing out a path and finding and kind of probing the path. The electrons themselves, they move very, very slowly, even if I think in copper they move like 2.5 millimeters per second or something. Like the current, the response, it's like you have a chain of electrons, and you push in one, and then the impulse is very, very quick, and then the one gets pushed out on the other end. But the actual motion, because they're so tiny and there's so many of them, they're actually moving very, very slowly. And so this is for copper. Copper being a good conductor to conduct electric charges. Air, ions, is a terrible conductor. Air is not conducing electricity very well at all, unless you happen to already have a current, and then the current itself becomes a bridge for others to piggyback on top of. So we have in condensed matter, means like solid things like water, liquids, and solids. Condensed matter, we have Pauli exclusion principle that, well, for all matter that is, for example, electrons and protons, they can't be in the same space. Like electrons, they actually, a wave function of an electron is defined by its orbit and its polarization. So if you have a hydrogen atom and one electron zipping around, and it's polarized either in one direction or in the opposite direction. And if it's in one direction, then and you want to add a second electron, it has to flip in the opposite direction, because they cannot be in the same in the same orbit. So this is a very, very strong rule that's upheld to a very, very high degree. So unless you get like to like neutron stars, then you have like, then you hit up against the electron. It's called electron degeneracy pressure, like the kind of pressure. At some point, the gravitational forces become so strong that this exclusion principle kind of starts to kind of push particles into the same physical space, even though they don't want to be there. But that's under very, very extreme conditions. For the most part, this regular matter that we have, they always try to be away from each other. The opposite is true when we're dealing with photons. Photons, like being the particles of light. When you're dealing with photons, they actually not only like, but they prefer to stack on top of each other. So while let's say you have a source which can just kind of randomly send waves out, and then if you have like a photon after a photon, it kind of spherically expands in a superposition, being everywhere at the same time, and then it collapses on a particular antenna, for example. And then you can say, okay, now you kind of shot the photon from here to here. But what you really did, you launched it, and it went kind of everywhere simultaneously, and then it collapsed onto a particular antenna. But if you have many of them, and the next is already coming while the other one is still, while it's kind of in transit, right? They still move at the speed of light, and they're not infinitely fast. They're very fast, but they're still they're not zero in time. There is a non-zero duration associated with these. I mean, on the lowest level, you have, for example, the Planck time, which is, again, all these Planck units, they are not, like, to treat Planck limit as a fundamental limit of reality is highly problematic, because what Planck really says is, like, beyond that limit, the model that we're running with quantum mechanics having like eigenvalues and being able to distinguish moments in time and distances in space beyond a certain resolution, you need to have so much energy to zoom in. This is what we don't really think about this when we use a loop, but like a general like low level low powered microscope. But if you have a high powered microscope, you need more and more and more energy the closer you want to zoom in. And at some point, the very instrument that you're using, like the optics, the light, the laser, the probing, the electromagnetic apparatus that you're applying, becomes so okay, I shouldn't be moving back and forth in this chair. Noise. So that becomes so intense. Hey, don't you have food? Go check. Maybe the monkeys ate her food. Sometimes are a bit friendly. Anyway, photons, degeneracy pressure, photons like to stack up on top of each other, and that suggests there is some sort of recognition in the sense that consider it like an awareness. It's not like the electron is aware where the other electron is, but since the electron itself is spread out through an area of space, even though it may be more concentrated, more probable around a particular area, it simultaneously is in many areas at once. And if there's another electron, then one electron feels the charge of the other electron. And so if one moves, then the other one feels the pressure to respond, even though that they are not in physical, like, immediate contact. And this sort of responsiveness is, why would that not apply for the branch of the universe sitting on? Because the mechanism by which the Schrödinger equation evolves, you might as well just run it for light. And if it applies for light, and that's how particles are coupling together and interacting with each other. Anyway, like, not just visible light, like all electromagnetic radiation, from heat until ultraviolet and radar and GPS and Wi-Fi and all that, that's all just one technology, if you will. It's just electromagnetic radiation, and then there's a wide spectrum, but it's not different things. So at least that part has to be consistent with what we know from lasers, that photons like to stack on top of each other, and once the current is open, same with, that's why I invoked the example with the lightning. If all this potential is so far kind of charged up until there is one path where there's sufficient amount of charges to overcome the resistance, right? The air essentially isolates the charges and keeps them from hitting the ground and going and grounding out in the earth, essentially. And once that charge is overcome, then it's not just one charges that are along that line that says, like, okay, now that link clears. It's like, no, all the links that can overcome the potential to get to that particular channel that is now open will also go and also kind of ride on top of that other current. And then now it becomes more conductive, and now additional charges also can jump onto the same one, and then you end up with a lightning strike, where once the connection is made, usually you see like a little thing kind of coming back up from the ground, and then the large thing coming back down from the ground, or from cloud to cloud. And once the link is open, then the whole field, everything that is accessible within once, clears all at once. And this sort of illustration of how electric currents move and flow, I'm trying to say it in a nice way, but I really think that should be the first consideration when you consider many worlds. That many worlds should always consider all possible reality at once, while upholding that principle that these realities on some level, while they're in superposition at least, they have to be aware of these other possible realities, because they have not collapsed in one way or another, and therefore you would have a more ecological pathway, if you will, a one which is more efficient, a one which is more relaxed, a one where you exercise less forces. And in the beginning we had this example with the driving of like accelerating and braking and yanking around the steering wheel and all that. Think of how you have, if everything has to be controlled or governed with a very lean fabric that is very elastic, and you have delays and the oscillations, and you need to find a way to guide the current to flow in the right directions. That would be more in the sense of what I'm suggesting. That you can't just force things and block things and move things around, because whenever we do that, we usually do it kind of out of laziness, because we say, I know it, close enough is good enough, and we just kind of make some often kind of abrupt movements. But if you really want to go towards maximal ecology, maximal efficiency, you need to be elastic and relaxed. You need to be able to conduct, to guide the current with the least amount of force possible, not to be lazy, but to not interfere with the systems, to interfere or inhibit or restrict the system the least amount possible, to still get the outcome that you wish. And the more gentle you can be with this control, the less force you have to act upon the system, and the less resistance the system will experience. And there's an inverse of resistance in electrical engineering. We have the concept of resistivity, which is how much resistance something poses, and the inverse, like 1 over resistivity, is the conductivity. And obviously, if you divide by 0, then you end up with infinity. And well, I mean, again, unless you say you're not allowed to do that, but at least when you come close to 0, you at least get a very, very large number. And in this case, we can think of whenever you have no resistance, none whatsoever, not even internal resistance, right? If you have no absorber, meaning like no bulb, no engine, no nothing, just a current of copper wire, that still doesn't have 0 resistance. It just has low resistance, and a lot of current is going to flow, but there is internal resistance simply for flowing through the copper. But if you really can get to a point where you have 0 resistivity, then you have perfect conductivity. That means your conductivity is infinite. You don't slow down, you don't absorb, you don't lose any of the energy, any of the efficiency. And the technical term for this is superconductivity, that you have something that can conduct perfectly. That means if you have what is it called, a toroidal, I think I heard this from Stephen Simon, that this one guy flew from France across the canal over to England by firing up a current in a supercooled, well, it's a larger box, and he flew the thing like without just cooling it as a kind of as a demonstration, then that it really keeps running, and it maintained its way all the way until he was already in England, and he brought the thing to a conference, which as it turns out was actually quite reckless, because the problem is if you just go a little bit past the critical temperature, the moment that you have, because the current is really, really high in there, the moment you have the slightest amount of resistance, that generates heat, that heats the system up further, right? That the problem why you get resistance is because it became too warm, because the cooling was not sufficient. And the moment it gets to a little bit too warm, then that additional friction that is being generated creates more heat, and then heats up the system more, and then that accelerates the process and kind of creates a runaway. It's not pretty. Fortunately, that didn't happen, but you definitely shouldn't do that sort of stuff. That's not. Yeah. Anyway, still, it's fascinating. And so, if you think of all the Everett branches like a decision tree, that you don't, when you deal with the decision tree, usually, I mean, depending on the situation, but usually you deal with some sort of probabilities, with some sort of, let's say you have, maybe sometimes you were willing to accept the high risk because there's a high reward or a high potential gain, and you say like, okay, this is a long shot, but if it works, it could really take us to another level. So maybe you are willing to accept failure, even multiple failures, until you get to a point where you can control the outcome and get the result. And once you get it, then you made it, and then you can build from there, right? But that means the payoff needs to be large. And otherwise, sometimes if it's random, you want to spread your position enough that you have, that you kind of have hedged your situation. So like, well, probably I will, if I kind of spread myself wide enough that there's a reasonable chance that I will have at least some positive impact. Right? That's kind of how Bitcoin mining works. That the more computational power that you have, it's not actually that the computation is doing anything useful and therefore you're getting rewarded for the work that you're doing. It's simply by running the same algorithm more and more machines, you represent a larger portion of the network, and since somebody in the network is going to get the reward, if your portion is larger, then the chance that you're that you will be on the upside of this, that you will benefit from this, gets larger. Unfortunately, the situation in the case of Bitcoin is, as far as we know, that computation is not doing anything useful. It's basically just, you know, the measure. You basically are as valuable to the network as you have a capacity to burn energy. And that may sound very horrible, quite horrible from an ecological point of view, but well, I guess the question is always, what do we do with it, right? We also can agree that, you know, burning fossil fuels is maybe not the best idea, and yet, to a certain extent, a case can be made that at this point we still have an energy dependence on fossil non-renewable resources. I don't think it's fundamental, but at least the way we are set up today with the kind of generators on islands and boats and cars and trucks, for now we still have this dependence. And so you can make a case that, okay, it's even though you know that you're not doing the optimal thing, as long as the impact is, the positive impact is larger than the negative impact that you're causing, then it's kind of acceptable. The problem, of course, with our regulatory systems is that usually the focus doesn't go to maximize the positive impact and minimize the negative impact, but the focus very quickly goes like, how can I offload the negative impact and only benefit from the positive impact, and then somebody else pays for the negative. And that of course is not a tenable situation, because in the end of the day, we're all living on the same planet, and if we just all throw the garbage and the waste onto our neighbor's yard, and everyone does the same thing, that's not a very good strategy. That's not really helping the situation. So from a purely energy efficient point of view, you can certainly do better. You can certainly build technologies that are doing something more useful. But at the same time, we want to keep in mind like what the function is. And as I already illustrated earlier with the example on cryptographic signatures and algorithms, the limit that we can have as much confidence in as we can have in anything is the limited energy availability. It's not a fundamental limit, right? You can always either develop additional branches of our technological capacities, where I mean, we're now hearing a lot about fusion here, fusion that. I met a guy who he was actually my diving instructor in apnea, and he had a PhD in plasma physics, and back then, that was like, I want to say 10 years ago or so, they were already within reach of getting to the point of getting from the plasma, extracting more energy, more electrons that you can run as a current than what you would be able to do by simply running. Well, basically, you get more energy out than you're putting in. This is not violating thermodynamics, because you're taking nuclear energy, you know, like we have with nuclear fission. There you also get energy out, but by essentially absorbing matter and causing all sorts of problems along the way. Similar problems are, well, fusion is better than not fusion, but if we just export a model of the world which is kind of adversarial, meaning like, well, as long as humans uphold a position that nature is a randomity that is essentially disintegrating and falling apart, and therefore some humans conclude that the only way to make sense of this world is to impose a strong will upon the physical reality and kind of force reality into submission. This adversarial, hostile attitude towards nature, it's just not wise, even if you can get away with it for some time. You know, if you keep agitating your environment by acting in a disharmonious or violent way, eventually that will produce some sort of repercussion. Not necessarily always the way that you created it, but I think that the person, well, I heard this from Hans-Peter Dürr, but this goes back to Schrödinger because, well, he was a student of, I think, Heisenberg. Well, obviously these guys were very close, time and space-wise. And so what Schrödinger pointed out was that the problem is not just the amount of energy in a sense of like that we can get clean energy, but the main challenge or the main risk that he saw was that we're getting very ordered, structured energy from the sun every day. And all of our biology, pretty much what is it, like 100 billion tons of biomass, like the discovering the surface of the Earth, not counting water, not counting rocks and minerals, but just the biomass, like essentially the carbon-based material, but a little bit wider. Just think the things that live and die and kind of decay and get re-assimilated and grow again and all that. About 100 billion tons, I think. Anyway, so that that turnover is pretty much perfect, right? Squirrel eats nuts, runs up tree, poops, poop decays, composts, new things sprout. Squirrel dies, also or gets eaten, also compost, right? We have a very high turnover rate of recycling in nature. But all of this is driven by having an energy source which provides very, very structured, ordered energy, and then all the biomechanical processes, starting with photosynthesis, learn to package or happen to package and structure chemical bonds, splitting hydrogen and oxygen apart, expelling the oxygen as the essentially the waste into the atmosphere for our benefit. Yeah, so from the perspective of a tree, the tree is mainly it's a little bit like a crystalline structure. I don't know if you ever haven't had the joy to do something like this in like maybe a chemistry class in high school or something, where you have a solution which over the period of a few days it starts to condensate and form crystalline structure. And now technically carbon is not the same as a crystal, like actually in diamonds that they are just carbons, but the form that we inhabit, the biological special case here, we wouldn't talk about crystals, but still the pattern that the mass of the tree comes mainly from the air. For me, when I was confronted with this, that was really kind of yeah, it's confronted me on a deep level, because I was like, well, it has roots, and therefore obviously it's going to drag up like whatever earth it's digging up and water and whatever, and it makes a tree. But in fact, the carbon comes all from the atmosphere, and the water that it's using, like H2O, so the oxygen is being expelled comes from the water, and the hydrogen is being used to assemble it with carbon also ultimately comes from the atmosphere, like from clouds and rains, and then yes, it goes through the ground, but it's not. There's not very much solid parts from the earth that actually comes into the tree. There is some portion, then there is some. There are some minerals involved, but for the most part, a tree really condensates carbon from the atmosphere and builds it, aggregates it into structure, which we then either eat as apples and strawberries and all that, or and then we have the metabolism essentially is chemically a parallel process to the combustion engine, in the sense that we have oxygen that burns, or well, recombines with carbon and thereby releases energy. So it was sunlight who, through photosynthesis, enabled that whole process, and because the sunlight was informing and driving that process, this chemical aggregation of throwing out oxygen and aggregating hydrogen and carbon and making a piece of wood, essentially, then you can set the piece of wood on fire, and then you get the energy back. But the energy that you get back wasn't in the earth, but it came from the sun. And the sun, in a sense, like a battery, it stored temporarily its energy in this higher energy structure, which is semi-stable until you light it up, and then you have a process that becomes exothermic. Exothermic means it liberates more energy than it requires. Like if you're baking or if you're cooking something, then you have an endothermic process. You need to add more and more heat to generate the result. Where if you have a combustive process, like you set something on fire, then usually you just have to get to an ignition point, and once you hit ignition, then it becomes not only a sustainable process, but in some cases it becomes a generative runaway process. That can be interesting and good for some cases, but it definitely is more on the side of flying than like flying planes than it is on the side of walking, in the sense of like the more that you go into a generative domain, the more you need to understand what you're doing and not just trying to force nature into submission. And so I'm saying this because I have a little bit of a apprehension, or let's say maybe even a distaste of the direction that how fusion is approached. Now, very impressive machines are being built, but fusion is upheld as the future of getting free, or essentially limitless energy. And it's done in a way where we're trying to force hydrogen under such high heat and such high pressures together that it kind of pops through the Coulomb barrier. So the Coulomb barrier goes back to this electron pressure that I mentioned earlier. And what you have is, at the center you have the nucleus, and around the nucleus you have some space, and then you have a lot of electric charge, and then it's kind of like a volcano from the shape of it, right? A lot, and then it drops off. So the more that you force two nucleus together, the more they're well, let's say one drops off like this, the electric potential, the one drops off like this, and the more you push them together, the more they start to jam and push up against each other. But if you push them far enough, then they pop through. Then you have like the central part where you have a gap around the proton, and the other one, when you push them enough close together, then the protons snap together, and then the electrons stay outside. That's called well, that's what is necessary to overcome the Coulomb barrier, to achieve fusion this way, hot fusion. This is not what's happening on the sun. Our sun is neither big enough nor hot enough to uphold and sustain or even enable that sort of process. What's happening in the sun is a different process. The sun, because it's such a huge ocean of pretty much only hydrogen, there's obviously some helium, which is kind of like the exhaust of like the burnt fuel, like the hydrogen is the fuel, and then it fuses and it generates helium as a kind of a residue of sorts. Fortunately, it's stable, but essentially you could think of it as a waste product. But then again, from bigger stars than the sun, which didn't just make helium, they also made oxygen and carbon and iron. And from a star's point of view, you can also argue that it's kind of a waste product, even though obviously it's not, because there's other functions, like all the carbon atoms that we have in our bodies and on this planet, they actually come from an exploded star, usually a supernova, and some other processes that generate this from a much older star. So our carbon does not originate from the sun. Nobody's claiming that, at least as far as I know. The sun is essentially a small star that is able to fuse hydrogen into helium, which is the most basic process, and it's doing so because of its huge number of this huge ocean of hydrogen as fuel, but not fuel in the sense that it's hot enough to reach the ignition point. If the sun would be intense, like packed enough, which it would have to be bigger to get that pressure, and then also hot enough, it would actually burn much faster. So larger stars burn faster than small stars, because small stars burn slower. And our sun is kind of like halfway there, because there's much small, well, not much, but quite a bit smaller stars than the sun. They're called brown dwarfs, and they have a much longer lifetime, because they, you know, it's like they're burning on a very low flame. That's why they're called brown dwarfs, because they're kind of like towards the infrared end of the spectrum. They're kind of warm. They're not really hot. If the sun would be hot, like hot fusion, it would actually be green. Our sun already is a little bit in the green spectrum. We don't really see this because the yellow is so dominant, so we just think, oh, golden yellow, that's the sun is just that. But there is actually a substantial part that is in the green, and even a little bit into the blue and higher spectrum, but predominantly in the yellow. And that means the heat contributes to the interactions, that all these atoms jiggle around and move and kind of affect each other and change each other. But ultimately what happens is when two particles just coincidentally, just by as far as we understand, by pure coincidence, happen to find into coherence, meaning they are described by the exact same wave function. So that's what happens when you have entanglement. You have two particles that complement each other, that you have one wave function that describes both of them. And then, you know, it's like the same thing with the spins, that they have to be inverted. They can be either way, but they have to complement each other. And when two particles go into the exact same, well, in this case, mainly it means that usually I can rotate around one axis, or then while I'm spinning around one axis, I can also be spinning around the second axis. But when it comes to particle physics, they can spin in all three axes at the same time. And so if from two separate particles, if they happen to just find themselves in a state where they are described by the same wave function, then they tunnel. Then you have quantum tunneling, and then they tunnel through the barrier. So remember that well with the proton and then the electric intensity. So here you're not pushing all, like if this is a slope, you're not pushing it all the way on top until it falls into the well, but you're just kind of pushing it up a little bit to get it probably close enough to have like a higher chance of success probabilistically, simply because the interaction become more agitated and become faster. And then what happens is tunneling. You actually, because of quantum mechanics, because momentum and position are always only defined to an approximation, there is always a chance that it's either a little bit earlier or later, or like that you have a certain uncertainty in time, or a certain uncertainty in position, in magnitude meaning momentum in this case. And so due to this quantum tunneling, it's essentially much closer to a statistical thing, that from an information theoretic point of view, you discover a higher ordered configuration where two formally separate particles can be described by the same function. And because you identify that higher order, as a consequence, energy is released. And now back to Schrödinger. What was Schrödinger so concerned about? At the time, and I'm sure by now we are way past that point, at that time, it was a statement by Hans-Peter Dürr. So, but that means still that was like at least 25, 30 years ago. Back then, we were already burning 25% of the highly structured energy that comes in from the sun, we were burning through fossil fuels and coal and all that stuff, and nuclear as well. The problem is if you have unorganized dissipative heat, right? If you think you pour fuel into a car and then you drive the car and the car gets you from A to B, but much of the energy actually goes into heating the engine and going into the exhausts and heating the environment and doing all heating air is not particularly damaging. But if you have a large part of our civilization to heat the environment or disturb the environment to a degree where it starts to compete with the energy which has structured that system in the first place, this is asking for trouble. And the analogy that Hans-Peter Dürr used was, if you think about your desk, and with a certain amount of time or effort, you make chaos, you open things, you take things apart, you kind of move things around, you kind of generate chaos, and then another amount of your energy you allocate to keep the system organized so it's actually maintained, so it's not a total disaster. Now, if you're 50-50, half the time you're making chaos and half the times you're trying to organize things, it will still be fairly messy. And at the time, apparently, we were up already at 25% of 100% that the sun was providing in highly structured ordered energy. We were already to 25% kind of messing around our work desk. And that is not optimal, and this is not going to be resolved simply by essentially controlling the intensity of these reactions. So again, from an engineering point of view, and also in some ways from a scientific point of view, it's very impressive what is being done, but it seems to, on one hand, being kind of I can't say going for a low-hanging fruit, because there's this joke that fusion is always 20 years away, because it was 20 years away, like 50 years ago. It was always 20 years. But we're getting to a domain where we learn how to control it. But again, if we're using an inadequate perspective upon the world to do so, we might end up aggravating the environment more by creating more disorder, more chaos, deviating more from the natural harmony of things. And the challenge with complex systems is that they are complex, and complex is not the same as complicated. Complicated can be, because sometimes it's just something maybe just be confusing because it's represented in a confusing way. That doesn't necessarily mean it's complex. Complex means that you have nonlinear interactions, nonlinear dynamics. That you have, like a billiard table is linear in its interactions, as are waves in the ocean, because they can stack on top of each other and they can run through each other. They don't really affect each other. But if you have other let's say, for example, the profile of a wing, an airplane, an airfoil, you have the airflow on top, on the bottom, which is more or less, ideally, it's pretty flat. But if you start to fly slower and slower and slower, then that pressure is not strong enough to keep the air in check, in a sense, and then you end up turbulences. And when you end up with the turbulence, it's not just that the turbulence is unstable, but the turbulence is bound to. All right, what are these guys doing? The turbulence ends up generating more turbulence, and it's kind of like a forest fire is already a problem by itself, but then the forest fire will also draw in more air, and then the air will bring in more oxygen, and then because the fire draws up, because it's like a hot air balloon. It has less specific weight, therefore you're buoyant, like the air is buoyant, pulling up. That draws in more air. more air brings in more oxygen. More oxygen is like a bellows, right? It catalyzes the fire to burn more. And so whenever you have nonlinear interactions, you have this potential self-amplifying behavior. Sometimes it signals, right? If you have a microphone and you hold it to the speaker, you get the feedback loop. So my sense is that we very often get excited when we learn how to hack one thing, and then we start messing with it, and often we're not far away in the sense that we know that it's a long shot, but it's more like we're almost oblivious in some cases with the aspects that we're messing with. Right? This is the problem with these self accelerating processes. Unless you have something that cuts the thing off, and that needs to be like on a very fundamental physical level, then it's like playing with fire. I love to play with fire as a kid, but you need to know your safety margins. You need to know when something catches on fire that is not supposed to catch on fire. You better have a contingency of how you're going to deal with this. And so you shouldn't play with fire around a lot of flammable materials where pretty much anything can catch fire, and when one catches fire, then all the other stuff is in fire, right? That's not the way to go. And yeah, my sense is we often have well, we can easily get carried away simply because we found out something new, and now we have fire, and then, well, first we had writing, and then we had fire. I think I'm not sure which one came first, actually. Well, both, like cavemen, they made ropes, but they probably also had fire. I don't actually know which one came first. But then eventually we had combustion engines, and then planes, and then more and more powerful devices. But they were all still using chemical energy, like even rockets going up and generating like these huge amounts of thrust to push these big objects up into well, GTO, the geostationary transfer orbits, and well, doesn't matter. Like, this is all based on chemical energy, and chemical energy is always entropic, meaning like you can, just like the process with the sun, essentially splitting the oxygen from the carbon, and then that generates or produces wood, and then from the wood we can extract it. We can only extract at the most as much as what was provided by the sun. But if we're going the route of fusion, or generally generative processes, where we're able to liberate more energy than it costs us to get it, like cost in the sense of energy cost, then we're, well, I guess this is just me echoing a word of caution here, because that seems to me, the moment we have this self-amplifying behavior without fully understanding what the dynamics are and where it's leading, it's very easy to lean out the window a little bit too far. And the same could also be said with what today is called AI, like this, all this kind of brute force reinforcement learning that pretty much is trying to brute force intelligence by hammering an algorithm with data and then probing it and let the algorithm mutate itself and become more adapted to an environment. This is very much consistent with the later interpretation of Darwin of like, well, we need enough heat, enough randomness, and then just probe things until, kind of the more ecological behavior surface, and then the more efficient configurations will surface to the surface, and they become operational. But just because something is more efficient, that doesn't necessarily ensure that it's desirable. Right? It's like, like burning a forest down faster is also being more efficient, but it's not desirable. And yeah, so it seems to me we are getting to a point where we as a species will, before too long, get master aspects of our reality, which at the very least can give us access to a lot of energy and also a lot of information. When you come to the computational side and AI, there it's often more of a data science problem than it is purely a physical problem. But they are subject to some fairly similar characteristics, because ultimately I actually consider fusion to be a problem of intelligence, like an informational problem of finding correlations among the wave functions and then controlling the wave functions to getting them into harmony. And ultimately, if you get them to synchronize up and you have two subsystems that then can link up and be identified by a superior, in the sense of like a higher order system that can govern both subsystems as one fused unity. Yeah, I consider them to be more related, like the actual intelligence aspect. What has been going on in the field of all these data science and machine learning? Yeah, well, I'm really fascinated by the human ability to explore and study and learn and create, and ultimately become more refined, more intelligent. And the most of what's going on in this field so far is in my opinion much closer to brute force. You know, many people probably disagree with me, but the underlying paradigm is still one that nature essentially is dumb, and that is basically just a pile of dumb mass that we can knock around and mess with. And I think having such a assuming such a adverse perspective to life, to assume that the universe is so opposed to life, I'm not sure if that's if it's a good idea to explore our abilities based on an assumption that the rest of the universe is dumb. Because for one, we're only going to look for the dumb things when that's our assumption. We're not even going to try to find out what else might be there. And also, you know, it can become a kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy. Now I kind of